forgotten warning. The Crythian Empire had conquered 47 star systems in the past 2 centuries. Their method was always the same. They would arrive with diplomatic vessels, assess the strength of the native species, and then either absorb them peacefully or crush them with overwhelming force. It was a strategy that had never failed. Ambassador Varix believed this mission would be no different. His flagship, the Eternal Triumph, emerged from hyperspace at the edge of an unremarkable star system. The coordinates had been provided by their long-range scouts who had detected signs of primitive colonization on the third planet. A young species called humans had established a settlement here, far from their home world. It was a perfect opportunity. Isolated colonies were always easier to subjugate than established civilizations. Varix studied the data streams flowing across his command console. The human colony consisted of approximately 50,000 individuals living in a cluster of dome structures on the planet's surface. They had basic mining operations and agricultural facilities. Their technology appeared crude by Crythian standards. No orbital defense platforms, no military installations, no fleet presence. Just a handful of cargo transports moving between the planet and a small space station. The ambassador's second-in-command, Commander Thale, approached with a tactical assessment. His expression showed the confidence that came from 100 successful conquests. The humans would surrender within hours once they understood the futility of resistance. The Crythian delegation would present their terms, the colony governor would accept, and another world would fall under the Empire's control. Simple. Plain. Efficient. Varix ordered his fleet to advance. 3 heavy cruisers accompanied the Eternal Triumph, each carrying enough firepower to reduce the colony to ash if necessary. But violence would only be required if the humans proved foolish enough to resist. Most species recognized the inevitable when they saw it. The Crythians had perfected the art of intimidation through display of overwhelming power. As the fleet entered the inner system, Varix transmitted his message to the colony. He introduced himself as a representative of the Crythian Empire and explained that this star system now fell within their sphere of influence. The humans living here would be granted the privilege of joining the Empire as a protectorate. In exchange for their loyalty and labor, they would receive protection and access to Crythian technology. It was a generous offer. They had 1 planetary rotation to accept. The response came from a woman who identified herself as Governor Elena Rodriguez. She appeared on the communication screen with an expression that Varix found difficult to read. She was neither frightened nor angry. Instead, she seemed almost sad, as if she had been expecting this moment and dreaded its arrival. She listened to the ambassador's terms without interruption, and when he finished speaking, she was silent for a long moment. Then she told him that the colony could not accept his offer. She explained that humanity had learned long ago that freedom once surrendered was never freely returned. She said that her people had come to this distant world precisely to escape the kind of dominion that Varix represented. They would not trade one form of oppression for another. She thanked him for his offer and asked him to leave the system peacefully. Varix stared at the screen in genuine surprise. In all his years of diplomatic service, he had rarely encountered such defiance from a helpless colony. The woman spoke with calm conviction, as if she actually believed her 50,000 civilians could resist the might of the Crythian Empire. It was almost admirable in its futility. He tried to explain the reality of her situation, tried to make her understand that she had no choice in this matter. But Governor Rodriguez simply shook her head and ended the transmission. Commander Thale recommended an immediate demonstration of force. A precision strike on one of the outlying mining facilities would show the humans that resistance was pointless. No casualties would be necessary. Just enough destruction to make the consequences clear. Varix considered the suggestion and gave his approval. Sometimes the primitives needed to see the sword before they would kneel. The lead cruiser charged its plasma cannons and locked onto a mining complex on the planet's northern continent. The weapon systems hummed with power as they prepared to fire. Varix watched the targeting displays, expecting to see the humans scramble in panic as they realized what was about to happen. Instead, something else appeared on his sensors. A ship emerged from the shadow of the planet's largest moon. It was unlike any vessel Varix had ever seen. The design was brutal and utilitarian, all sharp angles and exposed weapon systems. The hull was dark gray, almost black, with no decorative elements or aesthetic considerations. It looked like something built for a single purpose, and that purpose was war. The vessel broadcast its identification on all frequencies. It called itself the Defiant. The human warship positioned itself between the Crythian fleet and the colony. It was alone against 4 Crythian vessels, outmatched in both size and numbers. Yet it showed no signs of retreat or hesitation. Instead, it transmitted a message that appeared on every screen in Varex's command center. The voice belonged to a man who identified himself as Captain James Rourke. He spoke in the Crithian language, his pronunciation perfect, his tone completely devoid of fear. Captain Rourke stated that the human colony was under the protection of Earth's Expeditionary Defense Force. Any attack on the settlement would be considered an act of war against humanity. He ordered the Crithian fleet to withdraw immediately or face the consequences. The message was not a plea or a negotiation. It was a statement of fact delivered with absolute certainty. Varex found himself torn between amusement and irritation. The human captain spoke as if he actually held a position of strength. One aging warship against the pride of the Crithian military. It was absurd. He opened a communication channel and tried to reason with this Captain Rourke. He explained that the Defiant could not possibly protect the colony against 4 Crithian cruisers. He urged the captain to stand down and allow the diplomatic process to continue. Bloodshed was unnecessary if the humans would simply accept reality. Captain Rourke's response was brief. He said that humanity had learned to define its own reality through centuries of conflict and survival. He said that the Crithians were welcome to test their assumptions if they wished. Then he closed the channel and waited. Commander Thale was outraged by the humans' arrogance. He demanded permission to destroy the Defiant and proceed with the demonstration attack. Varex hesitated. Something about the human captain's confidence troubled him. It seemed too genuine, too certain to be mere bravado. But what choice did he have? The Empire's reputation depended on swift and decisive action. If word spread that a single human vessel had forced a Crithian fleet to retreat, the consequences would be severe. He gave the order to fire. The lead cruiser unleashed a barrage of plasma bolts directly at the Defiant. The weapons were set to full power, more than enough to overwhelm any defensive system the humans might possess. The attack would punch through their shields and cripple their vessel in seconds. Then the Crithians would capture the crew and use them as leverage to force the colony's surrender. But the plasma bolts never reached their target. The Defiant's defensive systems activated with speed that Varex's sensors could barely track. Point defense lasers intercepted the incoming fire, detonating the plasma charges before they could reach the ship's hull. The precision was perfect. Not a single shot penetrated the defensive screen. The human vessel absorbed the attack without taking any damage whatsoever. Varex leaned forward in his command chair, his attention completely focused on the tactical displays. The readings made no sense. The human ship's defensive capabilities were far beyond what should have been possible for such a primitive species. Their targeting systems operated with accuracy that rivaled Crithian military technology. Their power output suggested energy generation methods that the Empire's scientists had only theorized about. This was not a primitive warship. This was something else entirely. Captain Rourke's voice returned to the communication channel. He said that the Crithians had been given fair warning. He said that humanity did not make idle threats. Then the Defiant opened fire. The weapons that emerged from the human vessel were unlike anything in the Crithian arsenal. They did not fire energy beams or plasma charges. Instead, they launched solid projectiles accelerated to tremendous velocities by magnetic forces. The concept was ancient and primitive in theory, but the execution was devastatingly effective. The projectile struck the lead Crithian cruiser before its shields could adapt. The kinetic impact was enormous, far greater than any energy weapon could produce. The cruiser's armor buckled and tore under the assault. Secondary explosions rippled through the vessel as the projectiles penetrated deep into its interior. In less than 30 seconds, the proud warship was reduced to a crippled hulk, its power systems failing, its crew scrambling for escape pods. Varex watched in horror as one of his ships was effectively destroyed by a single salvo. The other cruisers immediately returned fire, launching everything they had at the human vessel. Dozens of plasma bolts streaked through space, converging on the Defiant from multiple angles. Surely no defensive system could intercept them all. But once again the human ship proved him wrong. Its point defense network operated with mechanical precision, destroying incoming fire with minimal wasted effort. The few shots that penetrated the defensive screen struck shields that absorbed the energy without significant degradation. Commander Thale was shouting orders, trying to coordinate a more effective attack pattern. But Varex barely heard him. His mind was struggling to process what he was witnessing. The Crithian Empire had conquered dozens of civilizations. They had faced resistance before, encountered unexpected technology, adapted to new threats. But this was different. The humans were not just defending themselves. They were dominating the engagement with casual efficiency. Their single warship was dismantling his fleet as if it were a training exercise. The Defiant continued its assault. Its weapons systems cycled with relentless rhythm, each salvo precisely targeted to exploit weaknesses in Crythian ship design. Another cruiser took critical damage, its main engines exploding as a projectile struck a vulnerable power coupling. The third cruiser attempted to retreat, trying to gain distance for a hyperspace jump. The human vessel pursued with speed that should have been impossible for a ship of its size, closing the gap before the Crythian crew could complete their escape sequence. Varix finally found his voice and ordered a full retreat. His pride was shattered, his confidence destroyed, but his survival instinct remained intact. The Eternal Triumph turned away from the colony, its engines straining as it fled from the human warship. The surviving cruisers followed, leaving their damaged sister ships behind. Captain Rourke did not pursue. He simply held his position, guarding the colony like an ancient sentinel, watching as the Crythian fleet disappeared into the distance. As his ship jumped to hyperspace, Varix realized that everything he thought he knew about humanity was wrong. They were not primitives. They were not defenseless. They were something far more dangerous. They were a species that had learned to survive in a hostile universe through innovation and determination. And now the Crythians had made them an enemy. The ambassador knew that this was not over. The Empire would not accept this humiliation. They would send more ships, more firepower, more soldiers. They would crush this human colony and make an example of Captain Rourke and his crew. But as Varix looked at the damage reports scrolling across his screens, at the casualty numbers from the crippled cruisers, he felt something he had not experienced in centuries of conquest. He felt fear. The price of arrogance. The Crythian High Command received Ambassador Varix's report with a mixture of disbelief and rage. 3 cruisers damaged or destroyed by a single human warship. An entire diplomatic mission forced to retreat without achieving any objectives. It was unprecedented. It was humiliating. And it could not be allowed to stand. Grand Admiral Corvin was summoned to address the situation. He was the supreme commander of the Crythian military, a position he had held for 30 years through a combination of tactical brilliance and ruthless efficiency. He had crushed rebellions, conquered hostile worlds, and maintained order across an empire that spanned light years. When he reviewed the combat footage from the engagement, his expression remained carefully neutral. But those who knew him well could see the calculation in his eyes. The admiral spent 3 days analyzing every detail of the battle. He studied the human vessel's movements, its weapon systems, its defensive capabilities. He consulted with the Empire's top scientists and engineers, demanding explanations for technology that should not exist. The answers he received were troubling. The humans had developed innovations that the Crythians had overlooked or dismissed as impractical. Kinetic weapons at relativistic speeds. Shield systems based on gravitational manipulation. Power generation using controlled fusion reactions. Individually, these technologies were known. But the humans had combined them in ways that created something greater than the sum of its parts. Corvin understood that this would not be a simple conquest. The humans had prepared for war in ways that suggested experience and sophistication. They had not developed their military technology in isolation. They had refined it through conflict, through trial and error, through the hard lessons that only actual combat could teach. This was not a primitive species stumbling into space. This was a civilization that had survived its own violent history and emerged stronger for it. But understanding the challenge did not change the necessity of meeting it. The Empire's reputation was built on the perception of invincibility. If other subject species learned that humans had successfully defied Crythian authority, the consequences could be catastrophic. Rebellions would spread. Trade networks would fracture. The entire structure of imperial power could begin to collapse. No, the humans had to be defeated decisively and publicly. The galaxy needed to see that resistance was futile. The Grand Admiral assembled a battle fleet of unprecedented size. 40 warships drawn from 3 different sectors, including 6 heavy battle cruisers and 2 massive dreadnoughts. Each dreadnought was a mobile fortress, 5 times the size of the largest human vessel, armed with enough firepower to sterilize a planet. The fleet carried over 20,000 Crythian soldiers, supported by assault craft and orbital bombardment platforms. It was the largest military force the Empire had deployed in a generation. Corvin took personal command from the bridge of his flagship, the Inevitable Victory. He had no intention of repeating Varix's mistakes. There would be no diplomatic overtures, no warnings, no opportunities for the humans to prepare. The fleet would emerge from hyperspace in attack formation, overwhelm the human defenses with sheer numbers, and secure the colony before any significant resistance could be organized. Speed and overwhelming force would decide the outcome. The journey to the human colony took 5 days. 5 days for Corvin to refine his battle plans and prepare his commanders. 5 days for the crew to ready their weapons and steel themselves for combat. When the fleet finally emerged from hyperspace at the edge of the system, they found the situation had changed dramatically. The Defiant was no longer alone. 12 additional human warships had joined it, arranged in a defensive formation around the colony. Each vessel was similar in design to the Defiant, built for war with no concessions to aesthetics or comfort. They hung in space like a wall of dark metal, their weapon ports open, their shields already active. And behind them, partially obscured by the planet's orbital station, was something much larger. Corvin's sensors identified it as a carrier, a vessel designed to launch and recover smaller attack craft. The humans called it the Artemis. It was massive, nearly the size of a Crythian dreadnought, but its purpose was entirely different. Instead of carrying weapons, it carried fighters. Hundreds of small, single-pilot craft that began streaming from its launch bays the moment the Crythian fleet appeared. Admiral Sarah Chen stood on the command deck of the Artemis, watching the tactical displays with calm attention. She was 53 years old, a veteran of Earth's corporate wars and the Outer Colonies conflict. She had spent her entire adult life preparing for this moment, for the day when humanity would face an enemy that sought not just victory but subjugation. She had studied every aspect of Crythian military doctrine, analyzed their strengths and weaknesses, developed strategies specifically designed to counter their tactics. The Crythians relied on capital ships, massive vessels that could absorb tremendous damage while delivering devastating firepower. It was a doctrine based on durability and overwhelming force. But it had a weakness. Large ships were slow to maneuver and vulnerable to coordinated strikes from multiple directions. The humans had recognized this and adapted accordingly. Sarah opened a fleet-wide communication channel. Her voice reached every human ship and every fighter pilot simultaneously. She reminded them why they were here. Not for conquest or glory but for survival. For the right to exist free from dominion. For the children growing up in the colony below who deserved a future without chains. She told them that humanity had survived ice ages and plagues, world wars and environmental collapse. They had learned that survival was not a matter of luck but of preparation, adaptation, and the absolute refusal to surrender. Then she gave the order to engage. The human fighters moved first, streaking toward the Crythian fleet in tight formations. They were small and fast, almost impossible to track with conventional targeting systems. The Crythian point defense system struggled to acquire locks as the fighters wove through space in unpredictable patterns. When they reached weapons range, they launched their missiles in coordinated volleys timed to overwhelm defensive screens. Grand Admiral Corvin watched as dozens of missiles impacted across his fleet. Most were intercepted or absorbed by shields, but enough penetrated to cause damage. Warning lights flashed across his command displays as ships reported impacts, breached hull sections, damaged weapon systems. The fighters were not destroying his vessels, but they were degrading their combat effectiveness, creating weaknesses that could be exploited. The Crythian capital ships returned fire with their main batteries, filling space with plasma charges and energy beams. But the human fighters were too agile, too unpredictable. They scattered and reformed, maintaining their assault while avoiding the worst of the counterfire. It was like trying to swat insects with a hammer. Possible in theory but frustratingly difficult in practice. Then the human warships opened fire. 13 vessels unleashing their kinetic weapons in a carefully orchestrated pattern. The magnetic accelerators hurled their projectiles across the void at speeds that made interception nearly impossible. The rounds struck the Crythian fleet with devastating effect, punching through shields that had not been designed to stop solid objects moving at such velocities. The first dreadnought took a dozen hits along its port side. The kinetic impacts tore through armor plating and penetrated deep into the ship's interior. Critical systems failed as the massive vessel shuddered under the assault. Corvin felt his flagship rock beneath his feet as secondary explosions rippled through adjacent sections. Damage reports flooded in from every department. Engineering was trying to stabilize the power core. Medical was overwhelmed with casualties. Weapons control reported that 3 main batteries were offline. The Grand Admiral had commanded fleets in dozens of engagements. He had faced determined enemies and desperate last stands. But he had never experienced anything like this. The humans fought with precision and coordination that suggested extensive combat experience. Their tactics were sophisticated, their technology was effective, and their determination was absolute. This was not a primitive species defending itself in panic. This was a military force executing a well-rehearsed battle plan. Captain James Rourke commanded the Defiant from his position at the center of the human formation. He had trained for this battle for 5 years, ever since intelligence reports first indicated that the Krithian Empire was expanding toward human space. He knew the aliens would come eventually. Knew they would bring overwhelming numbers. Knew they would expect an easy victory. And he had prepared accordingly. The human strategy was based on a simple principle that humanity had learned through millennia of warfare. Superior numbers meant nothing if you could not bring that superiority to bear effectively. The Krithians had 40 ships, but they were trying to fight as 40 individual vessels. The humans had 13 ships and 300 fighters, but they fought as a single integrated unit. Every move was coordinated. Every attack was synchronized. They were not 13 ships fighting one battle. They were one weapon with 13 parts. The battle raged for 2 hours. The Krithian fleet struggled to adapt to tactics they had never encountered. Their formations broke apart under the relentless human assault. Ships collided as they maneuvered to avoid incoming fire. Communication systems became overwhelmed with conflicting orders and damage reports. What should have been an organized military operation dissolved into chaos. Grand Admiral Corvin finally accepted what he had been refusing to acknowledge. He was losing. His superior numbers meant nothing against an enemy that fought with such coordination. His advanced technology was being countered by human innovation. His centuries of military tradition were being overcome by a species that had learned warfare in the harshest school imaginable, their own bloody history. He gave the order to retreat. The surviving Krithian ships turned away from the battle, their engines straining as they fled toward the hyperspace jump point. The humans did not pursue. They held their position around the colony, maintaining their defensive formation, watching as the proud Krithian fleet scattered into the void. Sarah Chin stood on the command deck of the Artemis, surrounded by her officers, and allowed herself a moment of quiet satisfaction. They had won. Not just a battle but a statement. A declaration that humanity would not be conquered, would not be subjugated, would not surrender its freedom to anyone. When Grand Admiral Corvin returned to Krithian space, he carried a message that would spread throughout the Empire and beyond. The humans were not prey. They were predators who had spent 10,000 years perfecting the art of survival through conflict. They had weapons born from desperate innovation. They had strategies refined through countless wars. They had a determination that came from knowing that failure meant extinction. The Krithian High Command convened an emergency session. They reviewed the battle recordings with growing dismay. 2 dreadnoughts crippled. 17 cruisers destroyed or heavily damaged. Over 4,000 casualties. And all for nothing. The human colony remained intact and defended by a military force that had proven itself more than capable of repelling future attacks. For the first time in 12,000 years, the Krithian Empire faced a question they had never seriously considered. What do you do when you encounter a species that refuses to be conquered and possesses the means to back up that refusal? The answer was not immediately clear, and the debate would rage for years to come. But on the distant human colony, in the settlement where 50,000 people lived and worked and raised their families, there was celebration. Governor Elena Rodriguez stood at the viewport of the colony's main dome, watching the human warships maintain their vigil in orbit. She thought about all the people throughout history who had fought for freedom, who had refused to bow, who had paid the price for independence with their blood and sacrifice. Captain Rourke contacted her from the Defiant. His face appeared on her communication screen, and for the first time since she had met him, he was smiling. He told her that the colony was safe. That Earth had sent reinforcements and would continue to protect its people. That humanity's message had been delivered and understood. Elena thanked him and closed the channel. She looked out at the stars, at the vast darkness that held both wonders and dangers. And she understood something that the Krithians were only beginning to learn. Humanity had not conquered the stars through superior technology or overwhelming force. They had earned their place among the stars through the one quality that no amount of weapons or ships could replace. The absolute refusal to give up. The determination to survive no matter the cost. The willingness to fight impossible odds because the alternative was unthinkable. That was what made humans dangerous. Not their weapons or their tactics but their spirit. The same spirit that had driven them from caves to cities, from sailing ships to starships, from a single world to an expanding presence across the galaxy. The Krithian Empire would remember this day. They would remember the name of the Defiant and its crew. They would remember the human colony that refused to surrender. And they would carry that memory as a warning to others who might consider humanity an easy target. The galaxy was vast and filled with powerful civilizations. But from this day forward there was a new understanding. A new truth that would spread from star to star. When you encountered a human warship, when you faced their determination and their willingness to fight for what they believed in, you had two choices. You could leave peacefully. Or you could learn the hard way why humanity had survived when so many other species had failed. The Crithians had chosen the second option. They would not forget the lesson they had been taught. And neither would anyone else who heard the story of the day when a single human warship had faced an empire and refused to back down.